Are live. Just give me a second here to get set up, and then we're going to get into the topic that I wanted to talk a little bit about with you guys, and that is how dogs' memory works. Like, do they remember? And if they remember, what does that look like? And what are some things that might influence a dog's memory? And I'm going to tell you guys some stuff that I've observed over my years of training dogs and working with dogs. So that's going to be kind of the topic of this live. But let me get my cigar rocking and rolling here, and then we'll go. So I'll also wait and let some people jump in here, and then we'll get started. How's it going, everybody? All right, guys, let's talk about the memory of a dog, because I think this is something that a lot of people don't really understand. Like, I'm sure there's been a ton of scientific studies on it, and people have done different things to kind of determine how dogs remember and what type of things seem to impact their memory. But I'm going to share some stuff with you guys based on um, based on what I've experienced with dogs. So one thing that I'd like to say about the memory of a dog is, obviously, they're not creatures of higher level cognition like we human beings, right? The way that they store memory and the way that they recall things probably, well, not probably, is definitely not as complex as the process that we as human beings undergo. But there are certain things, like, I think the best way to understand how a dog remembers things is if you understand a little bit about computer programming. And believe me, I don't understand that much about computer programming. I took a basic programming course in high school, and that was enough for me to know that I was not interested in the ones and the zeros. But fundamentally, how does computer programming work? Basically, it works like this: if this, then this; if that, then that; if this, then this; if that, then that. That's how dogs pretty much think, right? So there's not this complex thing like, oh, like, I remember that person and we were here last time and my owner said this, and it's not that complex. What it is it's basically classically conditioned associations between certain things, right? So for interest for instance, dogs that hate the vet office, right? Dogs that hate the vet office. All right. And it's a certain type of dog that hates the vet office, right? A lot of dogs, especially the ones that are a little bit more happy go lucky, a little bit more, relaxed, maybe a little bit less nervous type dogs, a little less high strung, a little less anxious, they tend to be okay at the vet, right? The type of dog that doesn't like the vet is the type of dog that makes the connection between getting the vaccinations or maybe some other uncomfortable or undesirable, from the dog's perspective, procedure and the environment of the vet's office. So they arrive there, they come into the waiting room, and the waiting room of the vet's office is probably not like anything else your dog's experienced. Think about, when would your dog ever be in that type of environment? So it's a very specific environment with a very specific set of smells, all the cleaners and the medical stuff that they're using, so on and so forth. That's going to have very distinctive odors, right? So the dog is getting an auditory experience. They're getting an experience through an odor experience and a visual experience. So the dog is experiencing, you know, things across all their senses, and they've made that quick association, or some of them have anyways, between, oh, when I see this, when I smell this, when I hear this, oh, that means that this thing that I don't like, where they poke me with the sharp pieces of metal, that might happen. Or when they muzzle me and they poke and they prod at me, or any of the other things that happen in a vet's office that a dog might deem to be traumatic or uncomfortable. But everything's very subjective, right? Everything's very subjective. That's the thing you have to understand. Some dogs find the vet traumatic. Some dogs don't care, right? So some dogs will go to the vet office and it's like, yeah, that uncomfortable thing happened, but people were nice to me and they pet me and I got a liver treat and, it was just another day and it was a good day and then after that we went to the park and it was fun, right? Now the dog doesn't remember it like that, but that's what happened from the dog's perspective in the moment when he was there, right? So he doesn't make any of those associations where it's like, oh no, this is the place where bad things happen. Because from his perspective, even though the same thing happened to dog B that happened to dog A, it wasn't traumatic for dog B, even though it was exactly the same stuff as it was for dog A. Dog A experienced like, oh my God, this was terrible. I thought I was going to die. Dog B, it was a mildly uncomfortable moment, but there was also a lot of fun. I got pets. I love pets. I got liver treats. I love the liver treats, right? And that more than outweighed the discomfort that the dog experienced. And the discomfort from that dog's perspective wasn't that like bad. It was just like, it's kind of like, let me put it to you this way. Like, for some of us that are more physically sensitive, there are certain things that are going to, like, think of it as you stubbed your toe. So you went somewhere and you stubbed your toe versus you went somewhere and you had your finger like cut off, right? Dog A experienced the finger getting cut off, even though it was the exact same experience as dog B, but from his perspective, it was just as bad as having, a finger or a toe cut off from your perspective. And then the other one was, oh yeah, it's like I stubbed my toe, but then all this other great shit happened, right? So you have to think of it from that perspective. A dog's individual nervous system and perception plays a huge role in the memories and the associations that they make. So, and I'm speaking now from a kind of like a more, let's say, a traumatic perspective, in that this was an unpleasant, undesirable experience. But now let's talk about it from desirable. Let's talk about desirable outcomes. And then we can go back to undesirable. So, desirable outcomes, right? I'm going to give you guys an example. To this day, when I finish tracking with my dog, right, we'll do a whole track, right? Everything will be done. I'll tell him to sit. And the second I tell him to sit at the end of the track, that signals the end of the track, he'll get really excited. He'll go into the highest state of drive. He'll go into that high state of drive because about 1% of the time, and I'm not exaggerating, about just 1% of the time, I play fetch with him at the end of the track. So that's 99 times I don't, but about 1% of the time, I have played fetch with him at the end of the track, okay? And I used to do this more in the earlier stages of the training because, tracking is very demanding and it was very difficult for him. And sometimes the tracks would be really, really hard. And I just kind of wanted him to be able to blow off steam at the end of the track. He made the association with the end of the track equaling a reward. And at the end of a track, every time I tell him to sit, right, we go through the whole process of tracking. I go next to him, tell him to sit. Even though 1% of the time I'll go, yeah, and I'll throw the ball for him. And that's really not that many times, right? He'll still anticipate that moment. He'll still go do that little, the dog whine when they're expecting something, like, oh, he'll do one of those, right? And that's on a very low level of reinforcement, right? Like they say the optimal level of variable reinforcement is 50%. That means if I was to reward him by playing fetch 50% of the time, okay, that's according to the science, right? Then I should be getting that response, that enormous anticipation, that positive emotional state that the dog goes into, or the active emotional state. It's positive depending on your particular perception of the dog's emotion and behavior. But from his perspective, he's so anticipating that ball getting thrown. But it only got thrown 1% of the time. So figure that out, right? Versus, when we're talking about an entire obedience routine or an entire protection routine or tracking in all the other aspects of tracking, right? Where the dog is frequently reinforced at 50% or higher levels of variable reinforcement, you're not going to maybe see that same level of drive and desire. Why is that? I haven't seen that same behavior from dog to dog to dog. I've seen that specifically with my dog, Gage. So that tells you that the way that they perceive things and the way that they internalize things, right, is different from dog to dog to dog. But there are certain types that I've observed that certainly internalize certain things more than others, right? And certain types of things. So I already kind of alluded to one type. You've got the sensitive, right? You got the sensitive, fearful, anxious, right? A combination of all of those things. And that type of dog, right, internalizes maybe negative experiences at a much more significant and impactful rate than maybe a dog that, like I said, is maybe more balanced, more steady, more less impacted by things like that, less nervous, less sensitive. So the dog that's more sensitive, the dog that's more fearful, the high strung type dog, those types of dogs internalize negative experiences significantly more. So you have to be very careful when you're training those dogs, right? Those are the type of dogs people say the dog shut down. The dog didn't really shut down, because shutting down is impossible unless you allow it to happen, right? Shutting down is just another negative response to, the application of pressure and training. So let's say, and I'm going to sidetrack onto this for a brief second. And in case you guys can't tell, I'm just kind of talking about this. This isn't like a structured lecture. This is just me kind of giving you guys some observations I've had over the years when I've worked with dogs, over the years of working with dogs, and kind of how their memory works. It's a very fascinating thing. So anyways, so when we're talking about the type of dogs that internalize negative experiences, right? The more sensitive, nervous, fearful, high, anxious, high-strung type of dog. When you're training, you have to be very careful about the application of pressure used, right? And you'll see a lot of handlers saying things like, oh, this shut my dog down, or I can't do that, my dog will shut down, blah, 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 blah. When training is occurring, okay, let's say you're applying negative reinforcement to a dog, right? The dog has a number of choices. The dog can fight. Well, number one, the dog can actually do what the pressure is telling the dog to do. So for instance, if I pulled up on a dog's collar, the dog can give to the pressure, can go with the pressure, can follow the pressure into, the desired behavior, assuming you're making the pressure in a clear way and the dog understands what you're wanting. So pulling up on the dog's collar, if the dog puts the rear end down, you should stop pulling, right? The dog can fight, try to bite you, okay? The dog can flight, try to run, or the dog can freeze. Freeze is the shutting down. My dog shuts down. Now, I'm going to tell you all this for free. If the dog flights, fights, or freezes, and you stop making pressure on the dog, okay, all you're doing is you're reinforcing that alternative behavior to the productive behavior you're trying to create in the training that you're doing, right? So if I was to pull up on the collar and he did anything other than put his butt down and I stopped pulling, I've reinforced that behavior. He's like, this unpleasant experience occurred. I did X, Y, or Z. None of them were the ones that you wanted him to do, right? That's what makes the pressure go away. He doesn't think, aha, I got away with it. I showed that stupid human, right? Like, it's not that complex of a thought process that they have. Instead, it's just, something, a stimulus occurred. Remember, they think in ones and zeros, kind of, this equals this, that equals that, right? This equals that, right? For him, right? This equals this, or this equals, I'll just freeze. I'll wait, right? Instead of this equals, let me put my butt down, and then the problem goes away, right? That's just negative reinforcement in a very simple way so that the average person can understand it. And this comes down to, when we're talking about how a dog remembers things, this also comes down to this concept of bidability, right? Dogs that are good with training, right? Dogs that we would consider to be biddable, that we would consider to be trainable. These are dogs that accept guidance from positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement well. So if you think about like your average lab, for instance, your average German Shepherd, these are dogs that generally take positive reinforcement productively, like they learn quickly through positive reinforcement, and they also learn quickly through negative reinforcement. They're productive with it, right? Whereas when we think of dogs that are less trainable, like your livestock guardian dogs, your Akitas, for instance, these are dogs that they can be motivated to work for a piece of food, or they cannot be. I've seen that a lot. They can oftentimes they're not particularly motivated for toys, right? To the extent that they're willing to do a lot to get those toys. But what they also have is often very negative responses to pressure, and it's not because the dog is thinking a certain way. It's just the way their system is. It's the way their system is wired, the way their stimulus response system is wired. Obviously, we've selected certain types of dogs, right, for certain types of jobs. So like your average hunting dog, your lab, your Springer, whatever, these are dogs that needed to be productive with pressure. If these were dogs that flew off the deep end every time you applied pressure to them, they wouldn't be particularly good or easy to train for their job. The same with your typical herders, right? Like your German Shepherd, your Malinois, so on and so forth. Now, the individual thresholds, sensitivities, motivations of these dogs vary across individuals, across specific bloodlines, and across, the spectrum of the different breeds. But fundamentally, these are dogs that we would consider to be trainable because they generally, in general, have a spectrum of productive responses to the positive reinforcement and to the negative reinforcement, which are both necessary components of training. Now we'll talk briefly about the Border Collie, because the Border Collie is a famous is a favorite of a lot of the force-free trainers, and we'll talk about why that might be. So when you think about things from the perspective that I've been talking about them, right? The reason why the Border Collie is a favorite of the positive only or the force free trainers is because they are high strung in general. They're also the type of dog that is highly motivated very easily, right? So if you get them to do something and you give them some drive satisfaction, a tug, a piece of food, they're very likely to re-engage in that pattern over and over again. They love patterns and they love doing things to get things, and these dogs were selectively bred for that. On the flip side, if you want them to stop doing something, or if you want to negatively reinforce them into doing something, it takes a very minimal amount of stimulation from you, to the extent that you can literally just raise your voice. And for many of these dogs, that's enough. That's enough pressure. You're still using negative reinforcement, but you get to say, well, I didn't use an e-collar, I didn't use a prong collar, I didn't, yank on the lead or any of these types of things. Therefore, I'm a positive only trainer. You're still fundamentally, if you're training the dog properly, following the routine of pressuring the dog into desired behaviors, pressuring the dog out of undesired behaviors, and reinforcing positively desired behaviors. But just the way that the dog perceives it, you don't have to maybe do what I have to do, for instance, when I'm working with a Chico, or when I'm working with your local Caucasian Ovcharka that, likes to go after other people and other dogs, because he's not going to respond the same way the Border Collie does, because the way he perceives things, the way his stimulus response mechanisms work are completely different, right? So the way he remembers things are different from training session to training session, because the way a dog internalizes experience, the way a dog remembers things, has a huge impact on how you train the dog, obviously, right? So a lot of dogs come in here for bad behavior, right? Oh, he's reactive. He's this, he's that. He nips at the leash when we try to, stop him from going to visit other dogs. The usual kind of like stuff that you see. A lot of these bratty behaviors. A lot of these dogs, like your lab, your Border Collie, a lot of these types of dogs, right, that we get in that have these behaviors, all it takes are one or two significant corrections for that undesirable behavior, and it goes away like it never ever existed, right? Because that type of dog internalizes that experience so significantly. That experience has such an impact on the dog that it changes the behavior fundamentally really quickly. It gets rid of that undesirable behavior really quickly. And then, of course, if you're attacking the behavior from the other end of the spectrum, where you're reinforcing alternative positive behaviors, Well, now you've kind of got it on both ends. Ooh, that was bad. We don't do that. But, ooh, this is good. This is good. This is good. This is good. Oh, we do this, and this, right? So you're able to train this type of dog really effectively, and you fundamentally change their behavior, and people will be like, oh, it's a completely different dog. It's not a completely different dog. We just use his stimulus response mechanisms to completely rewire how he reacts to specific things. So when you pull on his leash, instead of him turning around and biting the leash or jumping on you like a lot of them do, instead he's like, oh, this means I'll just go this way, right? And he just goes that way because his stimulus response mechanisms are really easy to impact, and he's also sensitive. So that, all he needed was one or two experiences where doing the biting of the leash didn't go well for him. And he's like, okay, that doesn't work. We're going to try something else. On the other hand, you'll get dogs that people call them stubborn, right? Or they'll call them stupid or hard to train. And again, it depends on how you want to use those words and perceive those words. But these are the type of dogs that they don't you can do something really aversive to the dog for a negative behavior, and the dog, you might think like you did something enormously aversive to that dog, but the dog didn't really actually perceive it as that much of an aversive experience, right? Maybe you hit him on the e-collar, maybe you yanked the leash, maybe you said no and you swatted him on the nose. Pick whatever thing you did. For him, he was like, it was mildly unpleasant at the time, but it's not enough that I'm going to fundamentally change all the things that I do. And also, his stimulus response mechanisms are so strong in the way that he's naturally responding now that it's much harder to rewire that. So, take your average... let's talk about a dog breed that's a little more... Okay, so take your average pit bull type dog that is reactive, right? Your average pit bull type dog that likes to go after other dogs. In many cases, when we get the dogs in that are like that, they have that strong desire to go after other dogs. They see another dog, their arousal level spikes, their adrenaline level spikes, and they go into all the negative behaviors associated with that reactivity or that aggression, right? That behavior is so hardwired. It's not just learned, right? It is genetic inside of the dog. There's genetics at play. There's learned behavior at play. You're kind of feeding that negative loop on both ends, right? So the dog sees another dog, smells another dog, hears another dog, and instantly you see him begin the process of getting into that mental state where he's going to do all that stuff, where he's lunging on the leash, he's snarling, he's barking, he's being crazy, and if he gets the other dog, maybe he'll chew the other dog up. And again, remember, stimulus response, right? He sees the other dog. Maybe he just smells the other dog. Maybe he just hears the other dog. Maybe any of those three things is enough, right? Or maybe he needs a combination of all those things. Every dog's a little different, right? For him, maybe they need to be within 50 feet. And then after they're at that 50-foot mark, maybe they need to be barking at him. Every dog has a little thing that it's like, okay, that's the thing now that sets me into this behavior loop, right? Now, if you were to just be like, no, bad doggy, don't do that anymore, right? And let's say, I don't know, you gave him a leash correction on the pinch collar. Well, now that would be, maybe mildly unpleasant for him, right? Would that change his behavior? In many cases, it simply does not, right? That's why they come to us, because it doesn't work. It doesn't change the behavior. They've done all the things that they can think of to do to apply a negative experience to that behavior they perceive as undesirable, right? In many cases, if you're going with more of a positive training approach, what you're doing is, look at me, and if you look at me, I'm going to give you these treats, right? You look at me, I'll give you the treats, we'll sit over here, we'll be calm. Oh no, he's getting over threshold, let's move him back out of the 50-foot range or whatever his range is to keep him under threshold. Or let's wait until, the dog is just within his threshold and remove him and, do this over and over again and desensitize him. Is this going to work? Well, no, it's not, because the positive reinforcement, if you're training in the positive way, isn't enough. You're not outvaluing the experience he's getting from engaging in that behavior. He's not engaging in that behavior because he doesn't want to. He's engaging in that behavior because it is a stimulus response loop that he finds, right, as a self-reinforcing behavior. It's a self-reinforcing behavior. He enjoys it, right? He enjoys going into that state of at the end of the leash, right? He enjoys maybe actually grabbing the other dog and getting into a fight with the other dog. He enjoys all of it, right? Doesn't mean that he can't feel also some level of insecurity in that, behavior pattern that he's, that series of behaviors that he's expressing. But also there's a significant element of enjoyment that is far outweighing any of those cookies that you have, that you're trying to incentivize him into offering an alternative behavior, right? Instead of the one that he's offering. And then from the other side, if you're trying to correct him with the pinch collar or the e-collar or whatever, your rolled up newspaper, if you want to go old school, it's not enough, right? It's not enough. Like whatever you're doing, it's not unpleasant enough that it's going to stop him from doing this thing that, again, he finds deeply satisfying to do, right? Regardless of how you perceive it. So all these things that you're doing in the multiple experiences that he has when he sees another dog, how is that impacting him mentally, right? Well, in many cases, all it actually does is it's gas on the fire. It just amps him up. It makes it more and more and more. It actually, why? Because he has to overcome these minor obstacles that you're putting in his way in order to engage in the behavior. Like think of somebody that's lifting weights. They start with the 20 pounds, and then they do the 30 pounds and then the 40 pounds, and they're getting stronger and stronger. And that's what he's doing, right? Instead of lifting weight, he's just blowing through the various obstacles that you're putting between him and performing that behavior he finds extremely desirable. So actually what you're doing by pressuring the behavior, right, or by creating obstacles, by even like trying to remove him from the situation, trying to distract him with something else, you're actually increasing the value of the behavior to him. Right? And it's not that he's having this complex thought process that it's like, oh, like they don't want me to do that, so that means I'm really going to want to do that. Or, oh, they corrected me that time, so now I'm going to go double the next time. I'm going to go harder than. No, he doesn't have this complex thought process. It's just happening. He's very much in the moment. He doesn't even know he's going to do it until his stimulus response mechanism is triggered by the sight, the sound, the location, whatever it is that sets him off, right? So, what's the solution? Well, I'll tell you what the solution is. What you have to do is, for me, I find a level of aversion, right, that is high enough now that he can't go through that level of aversion, and it's high enough that he's going to say, okay, no more of this behavior, right? No more. Like, I can't, it's not worth it. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, right? Like, I'll tell you what, and I use the speeding analogy all the time. If I could go 200 kilometers per hour, and if they pulled me over, they were going to give me a $40, $50 ticket, I'd do it all the time. I'd be like, yeah, okay, whatever, bro. I'll pay that $40, $50 when you catch me. No problemo, right? It's not going to affect me. Instead, they're going to take away my car. They're going to, my insurance is going to go. There's so many bad things that are going to happen. It's just the aversive, things that are going to happen are significantly higher than the reward that I'm going to get from going 200 kilometers per hour everywhere that I go in my car, right? So it's got to be the same for the dog. You've got to find that level of aversion, right? When you're trying to get rid of, we're speaking again now about undesirable behaviors, obviously, right? When you're, so speaking about like that pit bull type dog that likes to go after the other dogs, I'm going to find that level of aversion, right? And because I do this a lot, I know generally what to do to get to that place really, really quickly. That's going to snuff that behavior, right? That I'm now going to put an impediment because let's say that he's been engaging in this behavior for 3 years now, right? So he's got 3 years of built up experience. I see a dog, I smell a dog, I do this, right? Now, I know that half-assing it isn't going to change that behavior. That behavior is there. It's deep. It's genetic in many cases. There's a genetic component to that behavior. So you could say it's deep as his chromosomes, right? And he has so much built-up experience engaging in that behavior. So I'm going to find a level of aversion that's significant enough that it's going to snuff the behavior. And it's not just going to, push him into an alternate behavior like looking at me or sitting or whatever. It's going to snuff the behavior, right? When the behavior is snuffed, is my job done? No, it's not. right? My job isn't done because in that moment, I might have snuffed the behavior. But now what do I have to do, right? I have to generalize it. I now have to go again and show him that same experience in multiple locations with multiple different levels of stimuli, right? So maybe in the beginning, the dog just walks by and he learns that when the dog walks by 30 feet away, you're not allowed to go after him, right? So you'll see it. He'll do it. I'll punish him, right? And he'll be like, okay, I'm not going to do it anymore, right? And we'll do that again and again. And he'll see the dog and you'll see his little brain process it. He's like, stimulus, dog, right? And then, because I've applied my punishment to that specific situation, you'll see that the mind will be like, looks at the dog, looks at me, maybe like shows some stress behaviors like the lip lick, the look away, and you'll see him kind of try and figure out what is the contingency for the punishment, right? Like he'll be like, look around, and nothing will be happening. The dog will just be walking by, nothing will happen. And if the dog makes it all the way by him, right, and he doesn't do it, good job, buddy. And now I give him a positive reinforcement, right? And he might not even understand why the positive reinforcement happened. But all he knows is that dog went by him. He didn't do what he normally did, right? And this is me, again, attacking that behavior from both ends. I've now punished the expression of the behavior. So now you see he goes into that state of stress, that avoidance. Like, what do I do? Do I go away from the dog? Do I stay here? What level of this behavior am I allowed to engage in? Can I look at the dog? Am I not allowed to look at the dog? Can I smell the dog? Like, what can I do, right? And that's where I'll allow the dog to engage in some levels of self-discovery. Like, okay, the dog can go by you. As long as you're not reactive to him, as long as you don't engage in any level of arousal behavior, including fixated staring at the dog, nothing happens. And in fact, if you are successful in this, now you get a treat. Now let's escalate. Okay, you're good at that. What happens now if I go somewhere else and it's a different dog, right? Does the memory hold firm? Is the memory there still? Will you do the same thing or will you re-engage in the behavior? Which is why I always laugh, when these these various smoke and mirrors trainer on Instagram show like a dog that's being aggressive and he's in a room being aggressive, and then they bring the same dog in and it's like 3 weeks later and the same dog comes in the room and he's not being aggressive anymore. It's like, yeah, you've just habituated him to that environment. Show me him out in the world walking past strange dogs, and then we'll talk about how you've successfully rehabbed that dog, right? Because I'll tell you this, in many cases, the dog needs a variety of experiences in order to generalize and internalize the new rule of, hey, stimulus of a dog doesn't equal this response. In fact, it equals an alternative response, which I'll build in using some levels of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement if necessary. Instead of that, you get to do this, right? So here's the thing. Different dogs react different ways to this. Some dogs stay in that state of stress a little bit longer than others, and people get afraid of that. Oh my God, I don't want my dog to be scared. Well, do you want your dog to be aggressive? No, well, guess what? The process towards changing him into being neutral, which is my goal, by the way, is to neutralize dogs. I don't want them to be excited. I don't want them to be like, wah, happy. I don't want them to be like crazy. I want them to just be like, hey, this is life. I'm walking. I don't need to be uber excited. I just need to walk. Like, I want a dog to go for a walk like I go for a walk, right? I don't go for a walk like, woo! I don't go for a walk like, oh, where's the enemies, right? I just go for a walk, bro. And I want my dog to have that same kind of, hey, chill out, bro. We're walking, right? Yeah, you can go play here. I'll throw the ball for you in the field over there. But you don't need to be, I don't need my, I know a lot of like the positive only trainers like, oh, he's in stress because his tail isn't like in the air like a scorpion waving back and forth and his ears aren't perked up and he's not like, prancing next to me. It's like, no, he's not in stress. He's just in a state of normalcy. Like if I go look at my dog in the house right now, he's just chilling. He's walking around. His tail is like kind of like low, medium, his ears might be back. They might be up. Depends on how he's feeling in the moment, but he's chilling. He's relaxing. And that's the behavior that I want to make in that specific type of dog, right? So I now have to generalize that experience across a spectrum of different environments. But now I also have to generalize that experience across a spectrum of different dogs. Dog walks by. Is it fine? Yeah, okay, it's fine. What if the dog barks at you? What if the dog barks at you 20 feet away? What do? Well, in many cases, you'll see that as you change, right? As you change the variables, that behavior will pop up again and again and again, right? Because you've got that stimulus response mechanism built into the dog, that classical conditioning of if I see a dog do this, then I do that, right? And often when I do that, it's a bad thing, right? That's why the dog's with you for training. So you may have fixed it on your in this place here. Like you may have fixed it in the training center. You may have fixed it in your driveway. You may have fixed it on the street by your house. You may have fixed it with dogs that walk, but what happens when dogs lunge at him and bark at him? What happens when a dog runs by him? What happens when there's a dog that's growling next to him? What happens when a dog touches him? These are all variables, right? And if you're training a dog properly and you're serious about, let's say, changing a behavior, you're going to take a dog through all these variables and show him it's the same rules no matter what, right? And obviously, certain dogs really struggle with that process, and that process is longer. And then some dogs, all it takes is a couple of different, short meaningful experiences, and they completely change, and they generalize that change across a variety of environments and instances, and it holds for a long period of time. Doesn't mean that it can't crop up again, right? Dogs that are reactive, dogs that are dog aggressive, there's a genetic component to these behaviors. That means that if left unreinforced, if left, right, the behavior, if not looked after, if you don't look after it, right, in terms of, hey, you can't be reactive anymore. Hey, you can't be dog aggressive anymore. If you just say, okay, he's fixed now, I'll never ever do anything to maintain this behavior anymore. If you allow the dog to re-engage in a lot of the things that he did surrounding that behavior that were also unproductive, because I always say this, people always like, oh, my dog does X or Y, and how do I make it stop? And I say, well, listen, you can't just focus on that. There's also a lot of other things that you need to focus on. Dog training is a holistic experience. There's a lot of things that we need to focus on. When we are able to change how we walk with the dog, when we are able to change how we live with the dog, we can also change these specific behaviors and have these changes stick, right? Because what happens a lot of the times is people are like, okay, my dog's fixed, and they feel great, and it's a few months, and then all of a sudden the behavior comes back with a vengeance, often even worse than it was, because it turns out that what they're doing isn't enough to maintain that new baseline, that new stimulus response mechanism that the trainer installed, right? They're doing, in fact, things that are actually encouraging or reinforcing the alternative behavior that they perceived as undesirable in the past, right? My cigar's dying. Too much chit chat. Give me a sec. Sorry, guys. If I read your comments, I'm going to get sidetracked. So let me finish talking first. So where were we? So we were talking about, adjusting behavior and how dogs' memories impact that. And again, how it changes from dog to dog. Some dogs, they change so quickly, and they generalize things so quickly. And some dogs, it's a process, it's a fight, and you have to stay at it for a long period of time. And you have to be a lot more impactful with your punishment, with your negative reinforcement, and with your positive reinforcement than with other dogs where you really don't have to do that much in any of those, quadrants of operant conditioning, and you're going to have enormous impact, right? I do see that people are talking about my book. I do suggest you guys read it if you want to understand this stuff on a deeper level, because I get into all of this, and then I get into actually how to train a dog using and understanding these principles. I'm going to give you guys another thing that I've noticed, right? So how long with reinforcement, how how much reinforcement does it take for a dog to anticipate that reinforcement? So I'll give you guys a simple example, right? I'm training my dog. I'm working on my tracking right now. We've got our worlds next week, right? At the end of this week, I'm going to be going to Croatia, and I'm going to be competing at the FCI All Breed World Championships with Gage. And I've decided that I need him to slow down on the track. So I'm adding a lot more food to my track, right? That means in the past, my track would have significantly less food in all the footprints. But in order for him to slow down, I need him to check each footprint, right? So I'm putting significantly more food in the footprints. Obviously, I'm still variable. I can't beat every single footprint like 600 paces. I mean, my back would be broken if I tried to do that, right? All that bending over and putting the food in each footprint, right? But what level of variable reinforcement do I need, combined with pressure to also make the dog check each footprint, is necessary in order to create the change on trial day, that I go on trial day and he still checks each footprint, right? Regardless of the fact that, okay, he gets 250 paces in and there's still no food, but he still checks the next 250 paces as if each one has the possibility of food, right? When he stops believing that there's food in each footprint, what you're going to start to see is a speed change where the dog actually starts speeding up down the track. He's going to increase the pace down the track because he's impatient to get to the place where there is reinforcement. So the game is to create so much expectation in the dog's mind that each footprint may contain a piece of food that he continues to trust and check. And he has this habit, right? Dogs are very much creatures of habit. If you establish something with them and you maintain it rigorously and you consistently, create that anticipation, that belief that even if in this footprint there was no food, there's definitely going to be food in the next one. And he has that true belief, right? So that he can go through a 600 pace track, believing from one footprint to the next footprint 600 times. He can believe that if he just checks the next footprint, there will be a piece of food, right? That's fascinating stuff. So right now, in the past, I was like, okay, well, look, the dog's going to go into the trial, right? And he's going to start tracking, and there's not going to be anything. There's not going to be anything in the track. And I need him to still track even if there's nothing in the track. And I train for those circumstances. So what I got is a dog that would finish the track, but also a dog that would speed up as the track went on, because he would start to say, hey, you know what? I don't think there's anything in this track. Let me move on to the next thing. Let me get to the next thing a little faster, because maybe there'll be something there, instead of saying, no, I know we're 400 paces in, but I'm pretty sure at 401, there might be a piece of food. So I better check it the same way I checked pace number 1 on the track. What level of reinforcement? How many reps is necessary? Well, I'll tell you this. I don't know. I don't know. It varies from dog to dog, right? Some dogs, it's really easy to establish that belief in them, right? Other dogs, they're very wise to the variables. They'll be like, hey, wait a second. There's a judge over there. I've actually never tracked here before. The wind's a little different. The ground smells a little different. I don't think I'm going to get that same level of reinforcement here. Let me speed up and get down the track, right? Versus a dog that's like, hey, man, no matter where we're at, no matter who's around us, even though 450 paces in, there's nothing, I'm pretty sure 451 is going to be money, right? It's that belief, that slot machine belief, right? You keep pulling that slot machine and putting those quarters in because you think the next one you might just get rich. The dogs have to have that same perception, right? So I'm telling you this, all the way up until the trial, right, which is going to be happening in approximately, approximately 1 week. There's going to be this trial that I'm going into. I am building my dog's belief that there is going to be food in every footstep. I'll report back to you guys at the end of the trial, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it impacts my score, because I know pretty consistently what I've scored, right? I've always been 90 to 92 on the tracks with him at the top level, right, at the national level. Let's see now where that's going to put us when we get to the world championship, by just simply putting more food and putting more reps into the food. Is it going to be enough? Or is he going to suddenly get wise and be like, no, no, no. This is a trial track. There's nothing in this track. Let me just get to the end of this track. I'll still pass if he gets to the end of it, but I'm not going to get those points that I want, right? So just an interesting thing, right? So now let me say this. What if I had done the food thing from the minute he was like, I started tracking him when he was a puppy, and just kept doing it and never stopped doing it except on trial day? Do I think he would be slower now on the tracks and he would make less mistakes? 100%. 100%. 100% he would be slower. But because I went to less food on the track and stayed there for a longer period of time, he already has a classically conditioned response to less food on the track equaling a speed increase. So now I've gone back. I've used a lot of positive reinforcement, but here's the thing. When there's a foundation in a dog, when the dog has learned to do something a certain way, right, you must use a level of pressure to also overcome the foundation. No dog I find, okay, I find that next to no dog will change a consistently reinforced behavior, right, with just reinforcement for an alternate behavior. So I'll give you guys an example. I'll give you guys an example. If I have a dog who in the healing looks across my body, and I've gotten quite a few dogs that do this. In the healing, right, I buy the dog, he heals, but he looks across my body. He doesn't look up into my armpit, onto my shoulder, into my face. He looks across my body, which isn't a very nice look, right? It's a very old school kind of healing. How do I fix that? Now, a lot of people say, well, if you just put your reward up here, right, or you put your reward under your arm, now he's going to look up and he's going to get that reinforcement and it's going to change the behavior. But what you'll often find is, yeah, once he realizes that the reward is there, he'll look at it. In many cases, even that won't change the behavior. The behavior's so hardwired that the dog still does the look across thing. But now, when you attack the behavior from both ends, when you say, okay, I'm going to positively reinforce you, I'm going to give you a target in this area where I want you to look. Instead of looking here, looking across my body, I want you to look on my left side, right? Instead of just reinforcing this, right, I'm also going to pressure the alternative to this. So I'm going to put something here for you to look at, but I'm also going to introduce a negative reinforcer that you understand if you don't look at this, right? And then I'm going to use both of those things to change where you look and how you look in the healing. And that's just an example using healing, right? Somebody asked a very good question. I'll get to that in a second, right? You cannot change the behavior with just positive reinforcement. It never works. There has to be that element of negative reinforcement. There has to be the pressure out of the foundation behavior that the dog learned, the looking across the body. That there has to be pressure there. So now the dog's like, ooh, if I do that, that's uncomfortable. But if I do this, not only is it comfortable because there's no discomfort for doing this, there's discomfort for doing this, but there's no discomfort for doing this. But also, there's the bonus of the positive reinforcement that I can either look at or that will come down to me when I'm doing it for a long enough period of time. Now, someone asked a very good question, which I just caught when I was looking at the phone. They said, well, isn't going variable with the reinforcement going to increase the desire of the dog to check the footsteps, right? So she's referring to my footstep tracking. Yes, I'm still variable. I just increased the level of variable, right? So let's say I was at 10% of the footsteps having food, right? And now I've gone to 45% of the footsteps having food. right? So it changed the behavior of the dog because we went to a higher level of variable reinforcement instead of a lower level, right? The variable of the reinforcement is significantly higher. That's what I'm referring. I'm not saying I'm putting food in every single footstep. But how many of those does it take to change the dog, right? And how long do you have to do it before it holds up in trial conditions when there's nothing there? I'll let you guys know in a week. So these are just some observations I've had. I gave them in no particular structure or order. Another one I'll tell you guys is this. I get all the time a dog that, let's say we trained the dog a year ago, 2 years ago, okay? Your average pet dog. I trained the dog a year ago or 2 years ago. And the owner will bring the dog in and they'll be like, look, haven't really done anything with him in the last like 6 months. He was good for a while, but now he kind of doesn't listen to us. I think he forgot everything, and we haven't really been doing much with him. And I'll say, oh, you think he forgot everything? And they'll be like, yeah, we think he forgot. I'm like, okay, here, bring him here, right? So I'll tell him to do something. This is like a dog that we haven't seen for 2 years, right? I'll tell him to do something, and he won't do it, right? Or he'll ignore it or whatever else, right? Or he'll do something the wrong thing, but he won't do it. I'll correct him one time, right? Because a lot of the dogs that we put out here, the pet dogs, are e-collar trained. So I'll correct him one time at a moderate level on the e-collar or even at a higher level on the e-collar. And all of a sudden, you'll see that dog that was well trained when it left. All of a sudden, that dog will be sitting, downing, heeling. Yes, sir, come. Everything that you've asked him to do, all of a sudden, he can bring it up and do it again, and he does it properly, right? With the simple reapplication of pressure, one repetition, all of a sudden the dog is doing everything that he learned 2 years ago that these people probably for the last year haven't been making him do with any level of regularity. They haven't been asking him to do it. They haven't been reinforcing it positively. They haven't been reinforcing it negatively. They've been doing nothing. One application of a high level of negative reinforcement or a moderate level of negative reinforcement is all it takes to trigger the memory in the dog's mind of all these behaviors, all these verbal cues that you're giving the dog. Sit, down, heel, come, place. All of a sudden, he's able to do all of these things in like to a level of like 95% success, and he hasn't done it in a year. It tells you how powerful the memory is when you train with a combination of positive and negative reinforcement. The positive by itself, not enough. The negative by itself, in my opinion, also not enough. But when you put them together, right? But the biggest thing is this, the negative. The negative is more important than the positive, right? And I know a lot of people are like, oh, of course Haz is saying that. I'm telling you, for functional behaviors, the negative is more important than the positive. That is one thing I've learned. Because all it would take then, if the positive was more powerful, would be that I would tell them to heel and give them a hot dog, and all of a sudden they'd recall all of the behaviors that they were supposed to do, and they'd be doing them with a 95% success rate, and they'd be doing them under distraction, right? But no, unfortunately, that's not the way. I wish it was. Imagine that. Hey, just give your dog a hot dog from time to time, and he'll be a good boy. That would be really, really awesome, like if you could do that. But unfortunately, it's just not the way it works, right? Not that you shouldn't give them hot dogs, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have that same impact as that higher level of negative reinforcement that just seems to trigger the memory and the mind state of the dog. And it's like, okay, yes, we must do all of these things. When I hear this verbal cue, I must give this behavioral response. So, put that in your pipe and smoke it. What does it mean? I don't know. Think about it, right? But it tells you the impact that pressure has. But if pressure can impact a dog positively, right, as I've described, think about how negatively pressure can impact a dog when incorrectly applied, right? And the other thing, too, is interesting, right? So you say, okay, well, why don't you breed dogs? Why don't they just breed dogs that are super sensitive to positive reinforcement, like, I don't know, your average border collie, for instance, that is so motivated for positive reinforcement that they develop, complex behavior patterns with relatively, it's relatively easy to train them complex behavior patterns with what I would term to be not particularly high levels of positive reinforcement. And they learn these behavior patterns and they maintain these behavior patterns. And with low levels of negative reinforcement, you're able to also incentivize them to, you know, perform these behavior patterns as well, and avoid the negative, undesirable behaviors with very low levels of negative reinforcement, aka just raising your voice, stuff like this. Why don't they breed all dogs to be like that? Well, I'll tell you why. Because for a lot of the jobs that we need dogs to do, right? For a lot of the jobs that we need dogs to do, those good traits, those positive traits that I just described in the border collie that make them so trainable, right? Also have certain behavioral side effects. Neuroses, right? The dogs tend to be neurotic, so they can pick up bad behavior patterns just as quickly as they can pick up good behavior patterns. So I'm sure you can be thinking now in your head why maybe that might not be so good for the average, person that just wants to own a dog and not do much with it. I find that these dogs tend to not be particularly brave, um, because that level of sensitivity, um, there, that level of sensitivity comes from the dog's we've taken that natural self-preservation response that all animals and human beings have, and we've kind of twisted it a little bit so that the dog perceives the stimulus response mechanisms that we're utilizing in training so that we can, train the dog to do things in a specific way. But, I find that these dogs tend to be particularly soft. That's why when you watch a lot of border collies, a lot of the time they look stressed for no reason, even if nothing's happened to them. They're just standing there looking stressed because they're just in that state of kind of high strung anxiety all the time, right? And I'm not speaking about all of them, and I'm not even, saying that, every one of them's like that, because that's just not how the world works. I'm speaking in broad generalities, right? But there are certain things or certain traits that go along with dogs that are like that, that generally can make them undesirable for certain tasks, right? Like, especially tasks like, where the dog has to put him or herself at significant levels of risk. Dog man work, hunting dangerous game, being a guard dog, things like this. Those types of dogs generally don't do particularly well. Dogs, jobs that require a certain level of independence from the dog, where he's not constantly getting the feedback from the handler, that he has to be independent and just do the job, right? Have I ever worked with an Australian cattle dog? I've worked with quite a few of them. They're tough little dogs. The way I train an Australian cattle dog is the way I train an Akita, is the way I train a Shiba Inu, is the way I train a Caucasian Ovcharka, is the way I train a German Shepherd. I train dogs all the same way. I might use a little more carrot with some dogs. I might use a little more pressure, a little less pressure. It depends on the individual. It depends on the behavior of the dog. It depends on the drives and the sensitivities and the thresholds of that dog. But the principles are the same no matter what, So it's not particularly, it doesn't change from breed to breed, right? I think I've talked enough about this topic. It was, like I said, it was more of a ramble. I like talking about things like that. It helps me think about them. It helps me start to conceptualize certain things, establish certain rules. And this is, a lot of people ask me, like, oh, like, where did you learn X, Y, and Z, right? It's not from a book. It's from training a lot of dogs and observing a lot of behaviors and noticing general trends, right? Like, I didn't read a book to learn this stuff. Like, it's just thousands of hours on the leash with a lot of different dogs doing a lot of different things, from behavior, to protection training, to tracking, to obedience, to all the various things that you're going to do when you're training a dog to do things. Nin asks, does having two dogs affect relationship with the owner if there's an older dog already, not litter mates? Do they bond to each other? Does the new one become more aloof? It really depends on the individual temperament of the dog. So the reason why this thing called litter mate syndrome is a thing where they say don't get two dogs from the same litter. What you'll find is when you have two dogs from the same litter, or if you have even like two puppies that are from separate litters that you raise together, you know, what they'll engage in is a lot of really active, high level of arousing play with one another, right? And you as an owner are now putting yourself in a position where you cannot give the dog that same level of arousal and enjoyment as his litter mate or his, partner, that you maybe it's like I said, another dog from another litter can give them. So I'll give you guys an example. When I had Gage, I also had Dizzy, right? And Dizzy and Gage are within a few months of each other in age. Obviously, one is a Malinois, one is a German Shepherd, completely different litters, but I happened to have them around the same time. And they would engage in a lot of really active, hyper, aroused play with one another, and they would really, really have a lot of fun with that. But I limited that because, like they'd be so excited to go out with each other. Like if I would let them out to go to the bathroom, they wouldn't even go to the bathroom. They would just play and play and play. They would play with each other for like an hour, 2 hours. I mean, they're both high energy. One's a Malinois, one's a working line German Shepherd. So these are dogs that are, higher energy type dogs anyways. High arousal type dogs, low thresholds for that arousal, right? So they would engage in a lot of that type of play with one another. And it was, in a situation where it's like, okay, you as a trainer now, you're trying to incentivize the dog to do things, but the most fun that they're having is with this litter mate. The most fun that they're having is with, this other dog that's roughly around their same age and engages in that type of play. Now, when you already have an older dog and you bring a younger dog in, a lot of the time the older dog isn't particularly into that type of play. They don't want to play with the puppy the same way the puppy wants to play. So it's a bit of a different dynamic, and often it works quite well. But when you get two that are around the same age, that's when you get that litter mate syndrome that a lot of people are describing. And hear the coyotes barking. Must be fall. I haven't heard them in a while. Time to get the gun. So, William Chi says, how does the new CDC regulations affect your puppy sales? Well, they don't anymore because they were all basically put on hold when it comes to Canada. So we can ship puppies into the U.S. Somebody says, what is it? Mina says, hi, enjoyed your podcast with Oscar. You both said fighting pit bulls aren't rehabilitatable. There is no aversive strong enough to deter a pit bull bred for a fight with ample experience of killing. Well, you have to understand and a lot of people, that reel kind of went a little bit viral on Instagram. A lot of people predictably didn't like that we said that, and oh, I know this person that rehabilitates them, and that. No, well, we're not saying that you can't control those dogs' behaviors. You can give me a dog, I don't know, a pit bull that, let's say he's killed like four other dogs, right? You can give me that dog and be like, look, I want you to rehabilitate this dog. And I can look at the behavior and see that he wants to kill other dogs. Like that's his intention. He has a predatory intent towards other dogs. I'll say, I'm not going to be able to rehabilitate this dog. But what I can do is I can get you to the point where you can walk around with this dog. And as long as you maintain due care and control of this dog, and you consistently apply the reinforcers that I'm going to install in him, the inhibition that I'm going to install in him, as long as you maintain all those things, he's going to be enough under control that you can, live with him, right? And again, that will depend on your ability to maintain those things and your willingness to maintain those things. If you're, let's say a big softie, you don't want to correct the dog ever, you don't want to use a leash, you don't want to, do care and control with a dog like that, then that's not a dog for you. But if you're willing to do those things, to be like, hey, bro, you can't kill other dogs. And I'm going to continuously remind you of that, and also manage you appropriately in the various situations where you could potentially do damage to another dog, and continuously reinforce the training and the inhibitions that we've installed here. Well, that's a different topic. That's a different conversation altogether. Did we rehabilitate the dog, or did we just put gas and brake pedals and steering now in the dog so that, it's not going to drive itself off a cliff, so to speak, right? Or crash into an innocent victim? Did we change the dog? No, you can't change the dog. It's chromosome deep. It's genetic. It's bone deep in the dog. He would like to do that. I always use the example of a squirrel, guys. It's the easiest way for the average. I know a lot of people. People are so far removed from nature these days, so they have trouble with these concepts, right? Like, oh no, they must be forced. It's like, just because you think it would be mean and yucky to kill a dog doesn't mean that dog thinks that, right? He was bred for generations from dogs that didn't think that. He was bred for generations from dogs that were wired in such a way that they truly enjoyed every aspect of that endeavor, right? The fighting, even the pain from the fighting they enjoy. It activates them. It stimulates a response in that dog. For most people, pain creates a suppressive response. It's unpleasant. It's undesirable. For those dogs, think of it as a sadomasochist almost. Someone that gets off on pain. They get off on it. They like it. It actually increases the drive. It increases the arousal level in the dog. It's almost a sexual experience for the dog. It's not sexual like a human predator, that's like, a serial killer or whatever, but it's like almost sexual in terms of like the dopamine the dog is getting, the kind of relief the dog is getting from expressing that behavior. It's just the way they're wired. It's the way they're bred, right? People have trouble understanding that. And that's to their detriment, right? If you understand that about the dog and you're willing to manage that dog, then you'll be all right, right? And you're willing to do what's necessary to say, hey, man, again, going back to the squirrel analogy, right? I have a dog. He likes chasing squirrels, and he'd love to kill a squirrel, right? He might have killed a squirrel. I wasn't sure if it was him or another dog, because I found a squirrel once in the backyard, right? I can get him at any point in time to say, hey, bro, don't chase those squirrels. You're not allowed to chase them right now, right? And be like, all right, okay, I won't chase them, but I would like to, right? I know you would like to, but you're not allowed to do it, right? And I know that if I'm here and I'm maintaining and watching him and keeping him under control, he's not going to chase those squirrels. Would I leave him alone in a room with a squirrel, right? Well, no, because I know that enough stimulation from that squirrel is going to lead to him doing what he does with the squirrels. And most people can understand that when it comes to squirrels, but a lot of people struggle to understand that when it comes to other dogs or even humans, right? Not yet, dog trainer Subu. Soon, soon. Lisa says, curious if you use a slat mill or treadmill. I do not. I just train. Tara McFadden says, do you have advice for a small woman with big, strong dogs that struggle to make an effective prong collar snap to discourage pulling? I use e-collar and flat too, but he resists unless stim is very high. Yeah, Tara, it sounds like you've gone through a process of desensitizing the dog. So, like, if you're physically incapable of delivering, a correction with the pinch collar enough that it's going to disincentivize the dog from pulling, which it sounds like it is, there's no point to use the pinch collar. All you're going to be doing is desensitizing the dog with not, to that pressure and actually making him stronger. It sounds like you've kind of done the same thing with the e-collar as well, right? You have to use the e-collar if you're going to do this, but you have to use it properly, as I outline in my courses and in my book, which is not half-assing it, right? Which is what you're doing, which is why you have to always be on the upper end of the e-collar, right? Just as you can increase a dog's resistance to pressure, you can decrease the resistance to pressure as well, right? How's it going, guys? Sorry, I missed a lot of this stuff. I'm going to just quickly check. Margaret brings up a good question when it relates to tracking. All right. I meant, so she's saying, okay, well, if you're going to put 45% in one track, what happens if you put the 10% in the next track? Well, you can think about it this way. If I put 10% in the next track, right? So, like, let's say I did 45% food in one track and then 10% in the next track. What has that done, right? Let's say he gets really intense in the 10% track, right? What I've done, though, is I've basically shot one of the arrows from my quiver because now he's had an experience of very low levels of reinforcement on the track, right? So what you'll see generally is the drive and anticipation will go up, but what will that lead to? That will lead to him rushing, right? Because he'll be like, oh my God, next one, next one, next one, next one, next one, right? And he'll start rushing because he'll be like, as the track progresses with the lower levels of reinforcement is going to create that behavior. Now, if you do it once, maybe it'll be fine. But really quickly, remember how I said, if this, then this, that's how they think, right? Really quickly, he'll begin to recognize the conditions that mean it's going to be a 10% track, which will then increase his speed, right? So you need to keep the variable reinforcement at a level high enough that it does not lead to a speed increase, because you want him on the day when you lie to him and it's the trial and there's that 500 to 600 pace track with no food in it, that he goes the exact same speed across all the footsteps. Ideally, in an ideal perfect world. Does it happen like that in the trial? No, of course not. Usually there are some mistakes, right? The dog will show a minor speed increase or will do some other mistake, but we're trying to create as close to perfection as possible in a trial environment. All right, guys. Jason, that's a heavy duty comment. I'm gonna read his comment. Hey, as my son is hopefully being born in about 3 months. Well, God be with you, and I hope he is born in 3 months. What are some tips you can give me in raising him, as I didn't have a father in my life? I look up to you, and I feel like we think similarly. Well, I appreciate that comment. I would say this: as a father of two sons, I look at it as my job is to prepare them for the world, right? And that preparation looks different depending on the age that they're at, right? So obviously, my sons right now are in the toddler and the child stage, right? Like below the age of 10, right? So at this age, what am I doing? Well, I'm building. Obviously, you've got to give them some time and attention, but the time and attention that a man gives his children are different than the time and attention that a mother gives their children. I know in this day and age it's probably not particularly politically correct to say that, but I don't give a shit. So, obviously the way that we interact with the children is different, right? The mother interacts with them a certain way. She provides them with that nurturing. She provides them with that that love in a way that's very specific to her, and they need that from her. And it's not that you don't provide them with love, but you provide them with a different experience. In fact, they've done studies on like what happens when a father plays with a child versus when a mother plays with a child, and there's very different chemical responses that they experience, very different like brain chemical responses. So it's very important that you play with them. I look at it as this, right? And as someone now that's raised a lot of dogs, I kind of look at it the same way, and I see so many similarities, right? The things that I expect out of a puppy are very different than what I expect of an adult dog. But what am I doing with a puppy? I'm training them what to do. I'm having fun with them. I'm sharing an experience with them, and I'm enjoying the world through their eyes, right? We're taking them different places. You're watching the puppy play in like a new place and having so much fun, right? And it's experience. Like, look, I could go for a walk by myself in the woods and enjoy it. But if you go for a walk with a puppy and you watch that thing running around and just having the time of his life, it's way more enjoyable. It's exactly the same with kids, if not even more, because they're biologically yours, right? That does have an impact. Um, so I look at it as it's your job to show them the world. It's your job to build their mental resilience and their physical resilience. It's your job to exemplify what it is to be a man by what you show them. Not what you tell them, but what you show them. They watch you. You'll find, like, as he grows, he's going to watch everything you do. They're little sponges. They watch everything you do. They watch how you talk. They watch what you do, right? So, like, if you exercise every morning, they're going to see that, and you're going to see that they want to participate in that. If you eat certain types of food, they're going to want to eat that food, right? They're going to want to do exactly what you do, especially when they're young. They're little sponges. They just want to copy everything that you do. And everything you do is what they want to do. And they have no idea whether you're a winner, whether you're a loser, whether you're strong, whether you're weak, whether you're fat, whether you're in shape. They don't know any of these things, right? All they know is you, and they just want to be just like you, right? And then, of course, when they're older, that's when sometimes the wheels fall off and they realize that they don't want to be just like you, or that maybe they don't perceive you as someone that's, someone that's admirable, and they decide instead to go and try to copy somebody else, or, be around somebody else. But I look at it as, if you want them to be a certain way, so let's say you want your son to be in shape, you want your son to be strong, you want your son to be smart, you want your son, to work hard, and whatever it is that you want your son to be, you better be that. If you're not that, or if you're not at least aspiring to be that, what chance do they have? Because they're going to try to be just like you, right? So when you have a child, especially a son, right? Because you're a man, you're having a son. My advice would be the man you want your son to be, right? And if you're not, now's the time to change. I mean, he's not here yet, right? So if you're not, in the shape that you want to be in, better start getting in shape, or at least exercise. Even if you're not in the best physical shape, at least he sees you exercising, right? You want him to be, good with his hands? Well, better start those boxing lessons and let him see you going to those boxing lessons on a regular basis. You want to see him work hard? Let him see you get up in the morning, go to work. Whatever it is that you want him to be, you better be that. Because if you're not that, you can tell him all the things you want to tell him. He's not going to want to be like you. So that's my perception of it. Also, you're going to have to be the disciplinarian to some degree. Obviously, when they're young, not so much, but when they're older, relatively quickly, you're going to have to be able to put those rules and boundaries in place. And again, the way that men do that as opposed to how women do that with the kids is generally a radically different thing. And that's fine. That's why we do better together than apart, right? And that's why kids that are raised in a two-parent household have just so much better outcomes than the kids that are raised in a single-parent household, right? So, I don't know. That's a whole lot on that topic, but that's all that comes to me off the top of my head. Anyways, guys, I appreciate all of you. I know I didn't get to half your stuff because this was more of a, ramble sesh than anything else. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you guys have a fantastic week. I'll see you on the next one.